Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to our HAPI seminar series. I'm Adrienne Fu Berman. I'm co-director of the Health and the Public Interest program at Georgetown University. And we're an interdisciplinary program that focuses on the non-medical influences on health. We're an interdisciplinary program, and the way that I know many of you have been at our seminars before, but the way that our seminars run is we have a HAPI student, a health and the public interest student, Maggie, who's of course, and who's going to do the introduction and moderation, about 30 to 45 minutes of a lecture, after which the HAPI students will ask questions first, and then we open it up to the rest of viewers. So I think that's really all I have to say today. So I'm going to turn it over to Maggie.
Thank you. Today I have the pleasure of introducing Claire Bartholomew. She is an NYU Reproductive Justice and Women's Rights Fellow at Pregnancy Justice, a nonprofit advocacy organization that protects and defends the legal rights of pregnant individuals. She assists with pregnancy justice criminal defense work in Etowah County, Alabama, the epicenter of pregnancy criminalization. Currently, she is working to help file and litigate a first-of-its-kind federal civil rights lawsuit against the Etowah County Detention Center, alleging an unconstitutional pattern of deliberate indifference to the medical needs of pregnant and postpartum people. She also has experience working for organizations such as the ACLU Women's Rights Project, the Planned Parenthood Public Policy Litigation Law Department, and the Brennan Center for Justice. Claire recently earned her JD from New York University School of Law in 2023. Congrats. And previously attended Washington University in St. Louis, where she majored in psychology and English. A fun fact about Claire that she shared with me is that she recently got into watching reality TV to deal with the emotional nature and her job and just the world as a whole. And she just finished watching The Real Housewives of Salt Lake City and is now watching Summer House. So those are some great recs I got from her. Now I'm very excited to hand it over to Claire to talk to us today about her work at Pregnancy Justice. Thank you again for taking the time to speak with us.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. Yes, I'm an avid reality fan, and I feel my law degree really came in handy watching The Real Housewives of Salt Lake City because one of the women gets indicted for wire fraud, which is very dramatic. Anyway, thanks so much for having me. I'm here to talk about pregnancy criminalization. And this will sort of just be a primer on pregnancy criminalization. We released a really big report in September talking about trends, so we'll go through some of that data. And I am hopefully going to leave a lot of time for your questions. As Maggie just mentioned, I graduated in May, so I'm very much a baby lawyer. Actually just got admitted to the bar a couple months ago because it takes months to get admitted to the bar after you pass. So anyway, yeah, I'm at Pregnancy Justice, started there in September, and we'll get started. So pregnancy criminalization is defined as the punishing or penalizing of individuals. Also, if I'm talking too fast, someone just drop a note in the chat. I have that tendency. Pregnancy criminalization is the punishing or penalizing of individuals for actions that are interpreted as harmful to their own pregnancies, including enforcement of laws that punish actions during pregnancy that would not otherwise be criminal or punishable. And this comes from an Amnesty International report from 2017 that really broadly talked about the social and political implications of laws that police pregnant people's actions. I highly recommend checking it out. It's a very foundational resource. And quickly, before we move on, just a note on language. We, Pregnancy Justice, typically prefer the term pregnant people rather than pregnant women to really capture the full scope of people and circumstances that are implicated by pregnancy criminalization. But of course, sexism based on the gender binary and unfair roles is a very clear thorough line in our work and really underwrites all of pregnancy criminalization. And so also want to always acknowledge the influence of the patriarchy and historical legal structures, but that's just sort of how we go about. We often say like people with reproductive capacity or pregnant people, so we're being like as broad as possible. So our mission is we work to ensure that no one loses their rights because of pregnancy or because of their capacity for pregnancy. And we focus on pregnant people who are most at risk of state control and criminalization, which is unfortunately like any other type of criminalization, those who are low income, those who are color, and those who use drugs. And we use a lot of different strategies. We're really multidisciplinary. We're small and nimble, and so we do criminal defense of people who are charged with pregnancy-related crimes, which I will discuss what that might look like later. We do affirmative civil rights and constitutional litigation, and then we do coalition building, public education, training, research, documentation, policy. We really do a lot of things. And on the criminal defense side, to represent a client in criminal defense, you have to be admitted to the state bar in that state. And in a lot of the states where there is a lot of pregnancy criminalization, such as, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but such as Alabama, Oklahoma, and South Carolina, which is, the majority of our work, we are not admitted to the bar in those states. And so what we usually do is we work with criminal defense lawyers in that state. So we'll work with someone's appointed criminal defense lawyer or their criminal defense lawyer. We'll help them provide experts. We offer strategies and litigation support and just sort of provide kind of wraparound support so that, some of these crimes are very niche. They're not often charged. And so lawyers can often not, we'll have attorneys who have never worked on this type of these charges before. And so we offer sort of support since this is our area of expertise. So in 2013, we published this pretty big report on pregnancy criminalization cases from 1973 to 2005. And for that we called that our arrest report, and that documented about 400 arrests related to pregnancy from 1973 until 2005. And then we put out this report in September that documented the really alarming rise in reproductive criminalization even prior to Dobbs, which overruled Roe versus Wade in the summer of 2022. So this report only captured from 2006 until June 2022. So basically after our last report up to 2022. And in that time frame, we identified almost 1,400 criminal arrests. So basically in about half the time of our last report, we found more than triple the cases. There's been a really large rise in pregnancy criminalization, which unfortunately obviously tracks the rise in abortion bans and the rise in sort of all sorts of surveillance and policing of people who can get pregnant. And we're doing our data tracking for the post-Dobbs era now, and that's sort of an ongoing project. But we are seeing obviously abortion bans. We are seeing fetal personhood come up in civil and criminal statutes, and we're seeing this, general surveillance of pregnancy, and so people are generally at an even greater risk of criminalization, and we expect to see that in the data. And of course, the social and legal climate is really not conducive to general reproductive freedom. But it's important to note that this type of criminalization is not new. It predates Roe, it postdates Roe, it predates Dobbs. And so it has been here, it has been increasing, but it's not new. Oh, okay. There are the numbers they're the numbers, which was supposed to be on the previous slide. They're the numbers. Okay, so the big overarching themes of why we even have pregnancy criminalization is we have really these two racist political projects colliding. So we had the war on drugs, which really helped arm the anti-abortion movement with this narrative that so the war on drugs plays on this, lots of racist and sexist and junk science tropes about people of color and poor people and their right to reproduce. And then it exploited white America's fears of welfare queens. And then it also created this new category of crime victim, the innocent fetus, fertilized egg or embryo. There was a lot of junk science and fear mongering about crack babies. And these two projects, the war on drugs and then also the rise of the anti-abortion movement, really laid the groundwork for I mean, as we're seeing, this incredibly hostile environment for people with reproductive capacity. So this big report we put out in September, one of our research questions was, in the last 15 years, for people who are arrested for things that happen during their pregnancies, what was the outcome or status of the pregnancy at the time of arrest? When information permitted, was it, somebody got arrested for using drugs while pregnant, and then did they have a live birth with no health problems? Did they have a live birth with health problems? Was there stillbirth? That type of things. When there was a case that involved live births, we don't consider a positive toxicology drug test alone, a positive drug test alone, to indicate a negative fetal health outcome. So if we're looking for, what if there was a live birth, were there health problems or not? We don't consider just a positive drug test an indication of harm to a fetus, because the research doesn't support that. And oftentimes, hospital workers and social workers will note that an infant is showing signs of withdrawal. But there's a lot of research that shows it's a very treatable and temporary condition if it is properly addressed, which is rooming in after birth, breastfeeding, skin to skin contact, and sometimes pharmacological methods. But at the end of the day, the reality is that the majority of pregnancy criminalization cases involve healthy births, involve no real harm to the fetus, which is what we're seeing on this graph. 4 out of 5 arrests took place in just 5 southern states: Alabama, South Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Mississippi. And Alabama leads the country in criminalizing pregnant people, with a little over 46% of our cases originating in the state. And then Etowah County, where I focus, leads the state and the country. And it's really no accident that some of the states with the worst maternal infant health outcomes and highly restrictive abortion laws or flat out bans also rank higher in pregnancy criminalization. We see that coalesce all the time. I'm sure you guys have seen those articles about, states with abortion bans don't have Medicaid expansion, don't have paid family leave, don't have, good childcare options. It really is a coalescing of factors and really creating a very hostile environment. And one thing we see that's really interesting is that there's disparate enforcement of these types of laws, even within states. It's really by county. So for example, in Alabama, there's this one county, Etowah, where for whatever reason, the county law enforcement has really made this their mission to prosecute women who use drugs while they're pregnant or do other things that are perceived as harmful to their pregnancy. And then there are other counties in Alabama where they hardly ever use the laws. So it really is, it's very state dependent, and then it is very county dependent. To discuss demographics, 8 in 10 arrests of pregnant people are people who qualify for a public defender, meaning that they're indigent, meaning that they are usually below the poverty line or not very high above it. And because what that means is when you get arrested, if you're below a certain income level, and that varies by state, you can apply for a court-appointed attorney. Some states, it's a public defender. In other states, it's just a rotating cast. But the threshold varies, how much money do you have to be making or not making to qualify. But our data really confirms that most of the pregnant people who are arrested for actions taken during their pregnancy or not taken their pregnancy face really substantial financial hardship. And so it's people who are already struggling who then get arrested. Something interesting that comes up in the data is, given the legacy of the war on drugs, we really expected our current report from 2006, 2022 to involve a disproportionate number of arrests of Black pregnant people, given the war on drugs was very racialized. And we were correct, but the majority of arrests made were actually of white pregnant people, which is very interesting. And, as a caveat, there are several ways that our report doesn't necessarily capture the full scope of who is being criminalized. We only relied on official court documents to report individuals' races, but we know the criminal system often fails to accurately document many different types of identities. So we don't know what's missing from official court records. And we know that people of color are over policed, criminalized, and are often forcibly separated from their families and children. And so, they're being criminalized as well. And the other thing that's interesting is that all the people that we've seen who are getting criminalized are overwhelmingly have very low socioeconomic status. And so, although there have been more white pregnant people who are criminalized, they're also very poor. And there's been a lot of scholarship, which I will talk about later, about how these types of arrests really reflect the idea that even some white pregnant people are not living up to the ideals of white motherhood. And so really all of this is racialized, but it just is interesting how it has shown up in the data. I will talk about how these cases arise in a second. But I think one thing that has come up a lot for us is that the initial bail amount set for these types of cases, can be as high as $5 million we've seen, and can be much lower. But really, when you consider the fact that more than 80% of the people that we have identified qualified for a public defender, courts really leave people with little choice. And, obviously bail reform is a totally other situation, but really people are penalized for being poor. We have so many clients who can't afford bail, and so they are in jail simply before conviction, simply because they can't afford bail. And so that is really hard. And sometimes it's people who are pregnant, and they are in jail while they're pregnant, which is a really bad situation, which I'll talk about a little bit later because that's the lawsuit that I'm currently working on. So finally, quickly, time incarcerated. So a lot of these cases kind of exist in the shadows, and it's a little hard sometimes. Like, these cases aren't always publicized, they're not always popular. So in 66.4% of cases, a pregnant person will plead guilty to an original or lesser charge to avoid jail time. And so often a individual will accept a guilty plea and be sentenced to 2 or 3 years, but then given sort of a suspended sentence of supervised probation. And the length of our incarceration really varies depending on your county, a lot of different variables. And, if you violate, just like unfortunately any other type of criminalization, if an individual violates the terms of their probation, they can be sent to prison to serve their full sentence. Or they can serve no time, but still be under police surveillance or control for their full sentence. So, a lot of times what we see in Alabama, for example, is Alabama has this law called a chemical endangerment law. And basically the way it's written is saying if an individual exposes their child to a controlled substance, then that's a felony. And initially it was passed to arrest people who were, there was a methamphetamine crisis in Alabama in the early 2000s. And so they passed this law to be able to prosecute people who were manufacturing meth in their homes with children present. And then the Alabama Supreme Court said, I think it was in 2012, that the chemical endangerment law was talking about harm to a child, and that harm to a child includes harm to a fetus. It had not been previously interpreted that way. And so after about 2012, prosecutors had the green light to prosecute people for drug use, substance use while they were pregnant, because it was harm to the fetus under the chemical endangerment law. And so a lot of times what we see in these cases is somebody gets arrested for this, and potentially they have a substance use issue, and instead of treatment, they are taken to jail. And if they are given, if they have probation, often they're still not receiving the treatment that they need, and then it is considered a violation of their probation if they test positive for substances at another point. And so often we see people who are arrested for drug use during their pregnancy, they're sent to jail while they're pregnant, they get out on probation, they test positive for drugs a for substances again because they have not received the care that they need, and they end up in jail again while pregnant. So it's a really difficult cycle, and it means a lot of people, end up in jail for a long time before they're convicted, and end up staying there for a while. So to talk a bit about theories of prosecution and kind of why these cases happen. So really what we see is that pregnancy criminalization cases tend to have a lot in common. So a big thing we see is that these cases tend to have questionable legal grounding. And so often prosecutors are trying to extend the law beyond its initial intent. So one example is the Alabama law I was just talking about, which was initially not meant to apply to pregnant people. And then the Alabama Supreme Court totally changed that. Another situation, just as an example, I don't know if you guys heard about, but Brittany Watts in Ohio was charged with abuse of a corpse because she miscarried in her bathroom, and according to prosecutors, did not appropriately handle the aftermath of her miscarriage, which is, another thing we see a lot about. There are a lot of stigmas and stereotypes about how people should behave during pregnancy or how people should react to pregnancy loss. And that ends up, people get criminally punished for reactions that, a prosecutor thinks are not normal. And the reason I bring up Brittany Watts is because she was charged with abuse of a corpse, which had never before been used on a pregnant person for a miscarriage, for a stillbirth. Abuse of a corpse is meant to be, it's obviously it's an intense charge meant to be someone is tampering with. We didn't get into details, but point being, it had never been used in that way, and they really had to stretch to use it in this case. And eventually, the grand jury said, "This is a ridiculous use of this charge." But we see that type of stuff a lot, where we had a case where a woman was taking prescription Sudafed, which can trigger a positive amphetamine drug test result. And she was taking prescription Sudafed, had a child, baby was tested. And then she was charged in Alabama. She was charged with randomly prescription fraud because she had not disclosed to her doctors that she was on prescription Sudafed. So there are very, very weird applications of these laws, and prosecutors are really going out of their way to use laws that were not meant to be used in this way. Another thing we really see is that these prosecutions are very often not backed by science. There's a lot of junk science and fear mongering, especially about the effect of drug use on pregnancy and fetuses. And although a lot of it has been debunked and shown to be overblown, the power of those types of ideas is very, very strong. And it's very hard to debunk. And a big thing is that these prosecutions are really rooted in stigma, whether that's stigma against people who use drugs, stigma against people who experience poverty. And I was saying earlier, there's a lot of really entrenched narratives about how to be a good mother. People are criminally prosecuted for things such as they didn't get good enough prenatal care, but it's because they didn't have insurance, or there's no Medicaid expansion in their state. Things that, and as I was saying before, people are penalized for how they react after a traumatic pregnancy loss, or there are a lot of really deeply entrenched stereotypes about how pregnant people should behave, and it is really powerful. The other big thing is fetal personhood. And fetal personhood is basically the idea that legally a fetus is a person, which has a lot of implications. And the states that make up the vast majority of criminalizations in the country, Alabama, South Carolina, and Oklahoma, those are states that all have either legislation or court decisions that have recognized fetus as a person. And as I was saying earlier, Alabama in particular has this chemical endangerment law, which was initially passed to protect born children from environments where they could be exposed to controlled substances. And then an Alabama woman challenged this law because she was charged for alleged drug use during pregnancy. And the Alabama Supreme Court said fetuses are children. And in 2015, ProPublica and AL.com conducted this massive investigation that found that in Alabama, pregnant people were being arrested for using prescribed medications like anti-seizure medication, antidepressants, prescription Sudafed, as I was saying before. And so eventually the legislature amended the law to provide protection to pregnant women taking medication in this prescribed manner. But we still see pregnant people arrested for using prescription drugs. I just had a client get arrested for using prescription Sudafed because it's impossible to tell on a hospital drug test whether something is prescription Sudafed or amphetamines. So now we have to fight in court and argue that she should have been prosecuted for this because it's just the way it is. And we're litigating a case in New York right now where two women were accused of using opiates while they were pregnant because they had eaten poppy seed bagels. Like, these cases are incredibly absurd, and obviously I would never want to suggest that people who are using non-prescription substances should be criminalized, because that is obviously not what we believe. But it is especially absurd when you see the lengths to which states will go to prosecute people for things that it doesn't even make sense. And quickly on Alabama, I'm sure some of you saw the Alabama Supreme Court decision that threatened IVF because it ruled that frozen embryos are children. And we got there. The Alabama Supreme Court got there partially because of this previous ruling about the chemical endangerment law saying that fetuses are children. So, personhood affects everything. And once a court or a legislature recognizes fetuses as people in one area of the law, it can really affect other areas of the law, and is often not happened. And on the note of fetal personhood, as I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation, nearly all of our cases originate in a southern state. And we can really tie this geographic distribution and increase in criminalization directly to the expansion of fetal personhood, which again is this idea that fetuses and fertilized eggs have the same, if not more, rights than the actual person carrying the pregnancy. For example, in April of 2014, Tennessee amended its fetal assault law and became the first state to introduce a criminal law explicitly making it a crime to give birth to a child that had symptoms of prenatal exposure to some type of substance. And that law sunset a while, but affected a lot of people. And what we see is, as I discussed, Oklahoma, Alabama, and South Carolina define child to include fetus. And at least 11 states have pretty broad fetal personhood language that has potentially not been used in a way that we would lead to pregnancy criminalization, but could be. And there are 38 states that have some type of fetal personhood somewhere on the books. And so there are really broad implications for criminal law, family law, healthcare, IVF, as we've seen. And we're definitely seeing an uptick in fetal personhood post-Roe. So overwhelmingly, I'm going to talk about the types of charges quickly. Overwhelmingly, the types of charges that we see are child endangerment, chemical endangerment, like I was just talking about, neglect, or abuse. So about 80% of the people that we identified were charged under some form of an endangerment statute. And one of the things that's difficult is that often child abuse and neglect laws do not require any evidence of harm or evidence that the action led to harm. They require only that someone knowingly or recklessly acted in ways that risked harm. And so this sole focus on risk and not on actual harm is very key to pregnancy criminalization. Because as I was talking about before, for example, even if a prosecutor can't prove that someone's drug use actually harmed their pregnancy or their fetus, that risk of harm, no matter how remote, no matter how debunked science-wise, can be enough to sustain a charge. So it's very, and again, there's these powerful narratives about drug use affecting babies and et cetera, and the ways that people should be good mothers. They're very powerful and have a lot of legal power. And the conduct that we see pregnant and postpartum people being criminalized for, drug use, as I discussed before, sometimes putting themselves in a dangerous situation. There was a woman who was charged for getting in a fight with her partner, and she ended up losing the baby because he assaulted her, and she was charged with, provoking a fight. We've seen people get charged for not seeking adequate prenatal care. People get charged for having a home birth, miscarriage, stillbirth, and in rare cases, self-managed abortion, which we don't see as much. And as I said earlier, most of these laws were never intended to apply to pregnancy. And we're really seeing overzealous prosecutors kind of go out of their way to punish pregnant people. So child neglect abuse, which we talked about, these are just more charges. Manslaughter, murder, feticide, which is just homicide of a fetus, but is a separate charge. Chemical endangerment of a minor, delivery of drugs to a minor we've seen before. Like we saw someone get arrested with drug trafficking for using drugs while they were pregnant. We had this wild case. A lot of these cases are really wild, but we had this wild case in Oklahoma where in Oklahoma, medical marijuana is legal, and a pregnant person was using medical marijuana, and she was charged with child neglect. And her lawyers argued, she's following her doctor's orders. Medical marijuana is legal, and the court literally said, "Well, the fetus doesn't have a medical marijuana card, so you're giving drugs to someone who doesn't have a medical marijuana card." There's a lot going on. Improper disposal of fetal remains, that comes up sometimes as well, about with Brittany Watts, like what do you do after you have a miscarriage, which again is ridiculous because those types of events are incredibly traumatic. And we've had reproductive psychologists testify in cases before talking about how trauma, obviously people respond really, really differently to trauma, but prosecutors have used those types of trauma responses against people. We see self-managed abortion, pregnancy loss, drug use, dangerous situations, home birth, or refusing or delaying a cesarean surgery. We also see that type of thing. Another thing we see is we're really seeing this punitive approach to substance use by pregnant people. 9 out of 10 cases of pregnancy criminalization that we've seen involve allegations of substance use, and a quarter of cases involve alleged use of legal substances, such as medical marijuana, such as prescription Sudafed. Even as we as a society have developed more of an understanding of substance use as a mental and public health issue, obviously we have so far to go. And even as some states move to decriminalize drug use, pregnant people are still, subject to punitive responses for actions that would not be considered illegal, but for a person's pregnancy. Like, for example, in Alabama, the use of controlled substances is not a felony, but the use of controlled substances while pregnant is a felony. So we call this, but for pregnancy criminalization, of you wouldn't get arrested for it if you were not pregnant. And again, even though our data shows that white people are disproportionately criminalized, it doesn't necessarily mean that race is not still a major factor. Dr. Kiara Bridges, who's really a leading scholar on race and reproductive justice, says that the same policing targets that target policing tactics that targeted Black and Brown communities during the war on drugs extended to target poor white communities amid the opioid crisis. And there's this weird thing of you know, white people using opioids, poor white people, and having this, not quite whiteness yielding this reduced racial privilege, and poverty is a really big thing. And again, there's this ideal of white wealthy motherhood, and if you deviate from that, you're at risk of criminalization. We also know that there is no statistically significant, sorry, there's so much noise in the office. We know that there is no statistically significant difference in substance use among races. But for example, 65% of arrests of Indigenous people involved allegations of methamphetamine use, and 51.5% of arrests of Black people involved allegations of cocaine use. So even if drug substance use is not varied by races, prosecutions are. And as you can see, it's usually what we see most often is methamphetamines, cannabis, and cocaine. We also see people prosecuted for using methadone or Suboxone, so medication-assisted treatment to, safely wean off opiates. And often people are prosecuted for that because that can trigger a positive drug test. And that is obviously very frustrating for people who are attempting to manage their substance use. So we unfortunately see all sorts of things. And there's a lot of recent research that there are no criminalized drugs that cause pregnancy loss. And in fact, I think one of the things that is a struggle is that people don't, we're only now sort of beginning to talk about pregnancy loss openly. And pregnancy loss is exceedingly common. Approximately 1 in 5 pregnancies end in pregnancy loss. And in 90% of those, it's because of intrinsic genetic abnormalities. We have an expert that is a expert in placental science who does a lot of research on when there's a miscarriage, an unexplained miscarriage or stillbirth, what has caused it. And it is very, very hard to tell, and it is really hard to isolate a cause. And so often prosecutors will jump to that person used drugs, it caused pregnancy loss. And that is often not the case. And there is really no scientific evidence of long-term or certain or irreparable harm for fetuses exposed to substances. And a drug test is not a parenting test. It really doesn't tell us anything about the person's capacity to parent. And there are some states that are trying to move away from. In many states, if a pregnant person tests positive for substances, they're immediately reported to that state's child welfare agency. An immediate investigation is started for abuse, neglect, harm. And there are states that are trying to move away from that because it really doesn't tell you anything about how the person is going to be as a parent or if the child is at risk. And I mean, perhaps more important, basically every major medical and public health association has come out very hard against criminalizing pregnancy. And a big part of that is because it really deters people from seeking medical care. I have spoken to so many clients who say, I was using substances before I found out I was pregnant. I'm pregnant now and I want to seek prenatal care, but I am worried that the drug test is going to pick up, substances from before I even knew I was pregnant and I'm going to get arrested, or the child, whatever the child welfare agency in that person's state is going to open up an investigation against them. And, potentially that person will lose parental rights or have to really fight for their child. And it really erodes people's trust in the medical system. I've had so many calls with clients saying, I want to go somewhere where they're not going to judge me. I want to go somewhere where they're not going to report me. And this justifiable fear of being punished, whether that's criminally or by the child welfare system, or just by the shame and judgment, that really deters people from getting the medical care that they need. And we know this. And if we want to promote healthy families and communities, people really need prenatal care, treatment, and support, not criminalization and not fear of the state involvement. And so we have this Rise of Pregnancy Criminalization report, which is really a just a data set that's on our website. We also have a birth rights guide that we've published with the Birth Rights Bar Association. That's all about, in your state, can you refuse a drug test? What are your rights if you do get drug tested? What are the laws in your state? And then we also have this confronting pregnancy criminalization for providers and lawyers and all sorts of people to really figure out what's due on the ground. And here are our kind of general recommendations for stopping pregnancy criminalization. And this is what we really focus on day in and day out in our policy work, in our litigation work, really in everything we do. Repealing fetal personhood legislation and really promoting the full personhood of pregnant people. You know, personhood has really been hijacked, and there's not enough focus on how the pregnant person is a person who has full rights and full autonomy. We also support proactive approaches to decoupling healthcare and policing. We want to improve, promote, and expand informed consent laws. A lot of pregnant people are drugged without their consent. Drug tested without their consent, without any idea of what it will mean if they have a positive test. Also passing affirmative protections and restoring abortion rights, because really all pregnancy surveillance and criminalization is interconnected. It all feeds into each other. And also really following scientific evidence and making sure there are treatment options, and not criminalization of pregnancy and substance use. That is the end of my presentation. I really welcome all of your comments, and I believe Elizabeth will share the slideshow with you if you want to get in touch with me. But yeah, to answer any questions you guys have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen just because it's hard for me.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I really learned a lot. So right now it's kind of our Q&A portion. So I'm gonna first open up the floor to any health and public interest students that may have any questions for you. You guys can just raise your hand if you have anything. If I can kind of get the ball rolling. So you talked about how pregnant individuals are often incarcerated for drug use, go back to the habit and are punished again after released when they're denied sort of forms of addiction treatment. And I was wondering if drug courts ever work with pregnant individuals and if you see this as kind of maybe a potential solution to mitigate harm and provide a more structured form of treatment for those individuals.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it is sort of an ongoing debate in sort of, spaces that talk about pregnancy criminalization and substance use. I think there are some states that do drug court relatively well. I think, so just for context, the main state I work in is Alabama. We really work nationally, but due to Alabama having so many cases, that's really my most of my job. In Alabama, for example, there is often an option to be there's an option to by serving your sentence to go to a treatment center. And the problem that we often see is that there are very few spots for treatment centers because, as discussed earlier, a lot of the states that are doing this type of pregnancy criminalization are also investing the least amount of money in, pregnancy care, substance use care, welfare in general. So, I mean, I've spoken to clients who say, I really want to go to rehab. I want to get clean, and there is simply no mechanism for them to do so, or the wait list is really long. Alabama doesn't have drug court. But we've definitely seen it in other states, and I think it can work well. I think it is very hard to make it not sort of another extension of like the prison system. I think it's very hard for it not to feel punitive, and I think it's not really my area of expertise. But I think there are a lot of ongoing conversations about if we're going to have that type of diversion program, how do we make sure it's not the same sort of setup of punishment and deterrence that doesn't really work. It's also hard because sometimes we see people prosecuted for substance use who don't have a substance use problem, who maybe, we've had clients who use marijuana recreationally, or, you know, did cocaine a couple times and they are being asked to go to rehab, and they really don't. They've been assessed by a substance use, provider, and said, you don't have a substance use problem, and the state is saying, well, if you want to get rid of your symptoms, you need to go to rehab. So I think the processes are very much not science informed, and I think a lot more work needs to be done to make it really a productive and sort of lasting solution. I don't know if that answered the question. That was kind of cool.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was really helpful insight. Any other HAPI students? Yeah, Kandai, go ahead.
Hi, Claire. Thank you so much for your presentation. My question was, from a non-law perspective, what sort of help can, say, public health officials or other people contribute to the work of advocating against this misuse of law?
That is a great question. And I think, I think one thing law really taught me, like law school really taught me, is that the law really can only do so much, and often it is very much a tool of oppression. And I think there are so many ways to get involved. I think one big thing that we talk about a lot in the organization is really the narrative work that needs to be done around this type of thing. I just think, there is such a persistent, when I tell people what I do, there's just such a persistent response of, but isn't drug use by pregnant people bad? And I just think there's a lot of narrative work to be done around, we shouldn't be judging other people and what they do with their bodies, and B, criminalization is really never the answer, even if you believe that there is a harm. And I feel like people are always wanting to sort of put you on the spot and be like, well, don't you believe it's bad? And it's sort of like, it's not about that. And I think what we can all do, like outside of the law, is really like pushing back when we hear those types of stereotypes and types of narratives about like people being bad mothers, bad parents, and like needing to be punished. And I also think there is a lot of policy work to be done on this front. I do some policy work in my job, and we have a policy council that does a lot of policy work. There's a lot of work to be done about informed consent laws to ensure that if people are getting drug tested, they know what for. There's a lot of work to be done around ensuring that healthcare providers really know what their obligations are, because most of these cases originate from healthcare providers. Because a lot of healthcare providers are mandatory reporters, or believe that they're mandatory reporters. And so if there's a positive drug test, they will often report either to the child welfare system in that person's state, or to the police. And there's a lot of policy work that is being done around educating healthcare providers about, what does it mean for a pregnant person to have a drug test, especially because we've spoken to many doctors who say that, hospital drug tests are incredibly sensitive, and they will pick up drug use from months ago, or they will pick up a nominal amount of substance use. And in most prosecutions, there's not a confirmatory drug test. So, I think there's education for healthcare providers about the implications of reporting and when they really need to report. And I think there's a lot of policy work around treatment options for substance use disorders and substance use in general, as opposed to criminalization. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done, and in the healthcare space, just really advocating for public health approaches as opposed to criminalization approaches. I see a question in the chat. Are the majority of women in the southern states on board with these extreme policies? It's such a good question. I think, I don't know. I don't want to like hugely generalize, obviously. But I think there is, for in Alabama, for example, there is definitely this strong sense that we want to protect the baby. And I do think there are a lot of people who really believe that these types of laws and these types of prosecutions really protect babies. And I think some of the work we do is really try to get across to them. It really does the opposite because it makes people not go to the doctor. It makes people not listen to their doctors. And this lawsuit that I'm part of in Etowah County. Etowah County again is the what's the word? The epicenter of pregnancy criminalization. Like really has the most arrests by far. And so they arrest all these pregnant people for drug use and then put them in the Etowah County jail. In our lawsuit, we have heard horrific stories of people who are pregnant in the Etowah County jail and jails around the country. This is just the jail we're starting with. People being like pregnant people get put in jail and then they're denied prenatal care. They are not giving they're not giving the medications they're supposed to. They're not getting enough food. And then, they're experiencing health problems in jail and they're not being taken to the doctor on time. Our main plaintiff is a woman in Etowah County who was in jail and, labored and delivered fully alone in the jail cell because they would not take her to the hospital. So, I think, and so we are suing them for, it's a constitutional claim of deliberate indifference to medical needs. And I think part of what we're doing is really trying to highlight the hypocrisy of you as a state and you and your people are saying you really care about babies and pregnancies. If you really believe about babies and pregnancies, like if you really care, this is not the way to do it. You're putting people in even more danger and even more just horrible conditions. So I don't know, but I've definitely talked to people who are on board and really, we interact with some people who have really strong beliefs that these women are just bad mothers and, deserve what they get. And I think it's definitely, as I was saying before, it's a hard narrative and like sort of compassion conversation around like people need help. People don't need to be put in jail and people shouldn't be judged, but they should be given help. I don't know who put their hand up first.
I think Anya, if you want to go ahead.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
All right, perfect. So just based on your previous answer just now, on kind of the hypocrisy, which I think makes this situation especially compelling to advocate for, basically that the fetuses of pregnant people have even worse health outcomes once in the prison system, basically like the article we read before class. So because this population is pretty invisible once behind the prison walls, while progress is being made to prevent further incarceration, what is the path forward for advocating for better medical treatment for pregnant people who are currently incarcerated? And what are the institutions that inform and change prison health policies in general?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. We just had an Alabama call about this morning. So I think we are there, and there are a lot of organizations doing this type of prison condition work. Obviously, prison conditions are horrible for really anyone. And so I think lawsuits are one way. And it's sort of like, I think our strategy is like, we don't know if we're going to win the lawsuit, but we're really trying to make a lot of noise about what it is like to be pregnant in jail. I know there are some U.S. senators who are very interested in this issue, but it's hard because it is very state specific. And we were just talking in one of our Alabama meetings this morning about the fact that, so in most states, like the Department of Corrections handles healthcare, right, in the prisons, which is wild. And a lot of times what we see is people, the Department of Corrections will say, we are doing XYZ. Like they have these healthcare guidelines they follow, and then we talk to people who are in the jail, and it's obviously not happening at all. And there are a lot of complaints from the Department of Corrections. We don't have enough money to have a healthcare coordinator, have XYZ, blah, 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 blah. And so I think there is a lot of digging and a lot of like there is a lot of investigative reported going around about like what are departments of corrections spending their money on, because people in jail have horrible conditions, and like where is that money even going? And unfortunately, I think it is a much larger project because obviously jails and prisons are horrible for everyone, and there are some places that are worse than others, but there is no place that is good. And so I think there are a lot of different organizations working in coalition around this, and it's not really our main focus, but we got into this type of litigation because we were trying to think of ways to, in a really conservative state, prevent further incarceration and really like raise public awareness of what is going on in these jails. And one of the ways to do that is like file kind of a noisy lawsuit and get more information and get more public attention. But yeah, I think it is a very it's a hard problem for sure.
Thank you. Jasmine, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Claire. This has been a really insightful discussion. So my question kind of revolved a little bit again around the article that was sent around as well. And you kind of answered part of it, but I'm curious, wouldn't if these pregnant people are low socioeconomic status, wouldn't they qualify for Medicaid? And wouldn't they, because you mentioned that these prisons aren't able to, they mentioned like low funding, but wouldn't Medicaid step in and be able to provide? And there's also recently a bill that was passed to extend, and I know it depends on states that like have adopted, but extend the like post 3 month services to 12-month services.
Such a great question. And this actually just came up again on the call we were on this morning. In a lot of states, including Alabama, once someone is in prison, the Department of Corrections takes over and that person is not eligible for Medicaid anymore. It's really awful. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes no sense.
No, it really makes no sense. And yeah, no, I don't, it is really awful. So, and yeah, it's awful. Oh, and there's an option, like we were just talking about this earlier today, like the federal government last year, I want to say in the fall, put out like a Medicaid waiver, basically saying like states can provide like for people who are in jails or prisons, like they can be eligible for Medicaid for like 3 months before they're released, to like help them re-entry. But if you're in a state without Medicaid expansion, like Alabama, you're not eligible for that. And unfortunately, some states just say no. You know, like I think that's something we come up against a lot, that policymakers are sometimes just they're really resistant. They're resistant to receiving money from the federal government. Or there's also something we struggle with where sometimes we get the sense from departments of corrections people, they're like, these people don't deserve better healthcare. And that is, you know, obviously heartbreaking and awful and really, really messed up. But that is something that we, and like Anya was saying, like it is an invisible population. It's, and so I think a lot of what organizations like mine and other prison conditions populations do is really try to raise the alarm and raise awareness. But it is hard to get the general public to care. And I think people are very, very quick to not see people in jails and prisons as human and as worthy of, you know, sort of basic human rights. So yeah, it's definitely a struggle. But yeah, no Medicaid while you're in jail. Left to fend for yourself.
It's a good policy item.
That's really interesting. I was not aware of that.
Well, the Bureau of Prisons has its own medical system, so there's lots of criticisms that can be made of it, but it's not that you have no access to medical care.
Yeah, but like a lot of state-run prisons are under the state Department of Corrections, and they're always like a lot of state Department of Corrections people that we've talked to are like, we don't have enough money. But then you look at the state budget and so much of the state's money is spent on prisons. So it's sort of, not always sure where the money is going, I would say.
Are there any more questions? Sorry, I'm not sure what that was. From the HAPI students, and if not, I can turn it over to the larger audience as a whole. I see some questions, some more questions in the chat. So from Arlene Zoka, she asked, when speaking about drug use, what about alcohol in pregnancy?
Yeah, alcohol in pregnancy is difficult and sort of a weird paradox where it's like it is a legal substance that people are not getting prosecuted for. But I think, unfortunately, of all the substances people use, it has been shown to have the most direct harm on fetuses. But yeah, people aren't getting arrested for it. So, and it's, again, I think that's the type of thing of like there are not enough treatment options for people who are struggling with that type of thing. But even for alcohol, there is a lot of evidence that shows like, I mean, it depends on the extent of alcohol use. There are a lot of different factors, but there are treatment methods when an infant is born with what they call neonatal abstinence syndrome, when basically a infant is going through withdrawal. There are a lot of protocols that hospitals have put in place that can really reverse a lot of potential effects. But I think alcohol is definitely a trickier use. Obviously, the solution is never criminalization, but I think it is trickier because there is evidence of like real potential harm. And I just mean trickier in terms of like narrative and policy making, not trickier in terms of I think someone should go to prison, to be very clear.
And then we had another question from John Grogan, asking what is the role of the court of public opinion in advocating the justice system? And he references a book by author Michelle Alexander that talks about mass incarceration in the age of colorblindness.
Yeah, that book is amazing and really essential reading for, I feel like, really anyone. I think the court of public opinion is hugely important, especially with an issue like this. I think our courts, it's hard. Obviously, especially on issues related to reproductive health care, the courts are really decimating our rights, and I think it's a long project. But yeah, I mean, we talk a lot in my organization about narrative shifting, because I think that is a really, really big part of it. We just, like, as a society, have these really, I know I've said this over and over again, but it comes up a lot in the work of like, we have these just really deeply entrenched ideas about what it means to be a mother, what it means to be a good mother. And, we give a lot of grace to people in certain situations and really no grace to people in other situations. And I think it's incredibly hard to disentangle, someone is using drugs while they're pregnant and they're also struggling with poverty. And there are like a lot of factors that go into how someone is behaving in their particular pregnancy. Yeah, I think the court of public opinion is vastly important. I mean, for example, in Alabama, we have found that, it's very, very hard to get the chemical endangerment law repealed or amended. Like it is a really conservative legislature. There's really no option. But, now there's been all this uproar about IVF. And so there's some inroads because it's on people's minds. And then with this lawsuit we filed, an Alabama legislator introduced a bill about about jail conditions for pregnant people. So, and like, that's the most traction we have gotten policy wise. And and the lawsuit only affects, this one county, but it's about like, we trying to get as much public pressure and people just knowing that these things are an issue as possible. And so I think the court of public opinion is like hugely, hugely important. And I think, you know, for like, we have clients who want to talk in the press and like want to talk about their story. And I mean, it's hard. Like, how do you do that ethically? How do you not exploit people? How do you, but I think it is hugely important to highlight the people who are actually, who this is happening to, because I think a lot of the times, the fetus is privileged to such a degree that the pregnant person like barely exists in like the public eye. And I think as much as we can do to really center the pregnant person and talk about, what is actually happening to them and what they actually need, because what is good for the pregnant person is good for the baby. Like, that is what the science shows. And it's very hard to separate the two. And so yeah, I think the court of public opinion, that was very rambling, but I think it is hugely important to these issues, especially as courts and state legislatures become more extreme and like things continue to sort of seep. So yeah.
Thank you. These are super interesting issues that you're getting into, and great questions from everyone. If anyone else from the broader audience, students, have any other questions, feel free to unmute. You can send in the chat as well. I have another question just before we still have a little more time. So you talked a little bit about how the majority of those arrested for pregnancy criminalization charges are at or below the poverty line and are advised by public defenders. And I was wondering, I'm not sure if you have the data on this, but are public defenders kind of aware of these issues of pregnancy criminalization in ways that they're able to kind of thoughtfully advise defendants, or are oftentimes this disconnect kind of creating more issues?
That's a great question. And I think it really varies, but I would say, like, by and large, we definitely struggle with appointed lawyers, like, not having familiarity with the charge. Like, we often have clients who say, my lawyer has never had this charge before. Especially because it varies so much by county. So in Etowah County, for example, unfortunately, all the appointed attorneys there are familiar with chemical endangerment because it gets charged quite frequently. But we just had like a chemical endangerment charge in Baldwin County, which is a rural county in the south of Alabama, and the lawyer had never heard of the charge. That's definitely difficult. And of course, public defenders are incredibly overloaded and always have, like, they have so little time. So I think one of the ways we try to help is, like, we will try to do a lot of the work for them. Like, we will draft motions, we'll get experts, like, we will do as much of the legwork as we can to sort of relieve that burden and also bring our expertise. And sort of a long-term project of the organization is like educating defense attorneys about these types of cases, and like typical strategies we use or typical arguments we can make. Because obviously we're a small organization, we can't help every lawyer who is taking one of these cases. But that's something that we have been working on, is making connections with like public defenders offices and local criminal defense associations and talking to them about, here are these cases, here's what they mean, here's what you can argue, et cetera, because it really is just uncharted territory for a lot of lawyers. Like, understandably, it's a weird area of the law, and it comes up in very weird ways. So that's definitely, like, it's a big barrier that and it's like, once we find a lawyer that is really good at it, we're like always trying to use them. But it is just hard. And another thing is that there are not that many public defenders offices in Alabama. And again, that's just my area of expertise. There are not that many public defenders offices. And so if you're in a county and you qualify, you submit what they call in Alabama an affidavit of substantial hardship. And that just means you qualify for an appointed attorney. The way that it will normally work is that the appointed attorney is sort of like rotating through with the judge, and they want to keep getting appointed because that's how they make money. So a lot of lawyers, understandably, like, don't want to be too radical or like go too far and piss off the judge. So that's also a dynamic that we struggle with. There are a lot of factors, but it definitely is like a big part of our work is trying to figure out like how to ensure that defense lawyers are prepared and able and willing to really like provide the most wholesome defense for someone.
Thank you so much. If there aren't any more questions. Oh wait, I just got one more in the chat. From Devin Sword, what sort of programming or education would you like to see in law schools geared towards law students who want to get into criminal law on either side that care about this as an issue?
I mean, I don't feel like law school really taught me about this at all. I mean, actually, I was in NYU has a reproductive justice clinic, which we talked about these issues a lot. I feel like, I mean, I feel like the law school criminal curriculum, and like in most, at least from my talking to many to different people, is it's pretty narrow. It's based a lot on like very quote typical crimes like homicide and like manslaughter, even though that's really not the vast majority of crimes. I mean, I think the criminal law curriculum needs to be updated in general. Like, I think it is quite outdated in what it focuses on. And I think I would love to see more classes on like criminalization across different sectors. Like, I feel like there's not enough connections made in law school to like criminalization across like poverty lines, across like race lines, across gender lines. Like, I feel like a lot of times criminal law is really taught in a vacuum when that's not the reality of the situation. And I think clinics are a really good way, like clinics, basically just externships. I don't know if you guys had anything about that, but basically it's like when I was at NYU, I took the reproductive justice clinic. And so we would meet as a seminar, like once a week. And then we would also each semester like work with an external organization on a project for them. And I think that type of experiential learning is like really critical to learning about these types of issues, because I feel even at a school like NYU, which I think does a really good job of trying to talk about like real life lawyering, I think like law school is still very doctrinal and very like it's very divorced from the reality of the world and the reality of the way the law is practiced. So I think like more classes that really focus on like what does this actually look like in the real world would be helpful for people. But I don't really know. I didn't know that I was going to like get into any sort of criminal law when I was in law school, so I don't really know.
No, I think those are some great ideas. Oh, Joanna, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. This is like an extremely specific question, so it's okay if you don't have an answer. But I went to undergrad at University of Wyoming, and a lot of the gender studies students were working on this project with the state prison system. And they actually developed like a mother-child unit within one of their facilities. And obviously like the goal was for it to kind of be rehabilitative, and like allow for there to be like this early essential bonding time with the mother. Obviously it would be better to not have time in prison in general and get ahead of it that way, but I was just curious like if you had heard of these programs before, if you had any thoughts on whether they were like effective or helpful or just anything related to that.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, yeah, we work with programs like that before. Like Alabama has like a prison doula project that we work with, and I think that is incredibly vital harm reduction. I think like long term, we want to work towards a future where, I mean, like no one really is incarcerated, but where pregnant people are not incarcerated, specifically in my job. But I think especially in states that is going to be a hugely uphill battle. I think those types of projects are absolutely essential to maternal fetal outcomes and just like general mental and physical health of mothers and babies. So yeah, that's like we do some of that work in Alabama. Like we work with the Prison Doulas Project. This bill that we're looking to get passed is about like conditions for pregnant people in jails. So I think those types of projects are really essential, especially given that it's a really long-term issue that is not going to get solved right away. But I think projects like that are really important and essential. And like we've definitely seen success in the sense of like better outcomes for moms and babies in situations like that. And that is like, that is a goal on the way to the larger goal. if that makes sense.
Thank you.
So I think that is our time now. So I just want to say thank you again for coming to take the time to speak with us. I think we all learned a lot from your presentation, and just hearing about all your experiences was just super insightful and informative. So thank you.
Thank you all so much, and thank you for your really great questions. My email is in the slideshow if anyone has any follow-up questions or just wants to chat. I'm usually pretty available. Yeah, and thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Claire. If you could just stay on for a minute afterward, that would be great. And yeah, thank you. That was really great.